Well, good morning again to everyone here. Special welcome to those of you who are joining us online. We're so glad that you're with us this morning. So the first place that Becky and I lived in as a newly married couple was this tiny apartment in the northern suburbs of Chicago. We were grad students at the time when we got married, and we had this apartment that couldn't have been any bigger than 400 square feet. I mean, if we were lucky, maybe it was like 450 square feet. It had a living room that was kind of attached to a kitchen, and then a small bedroom with a bathroom, and that was it. But we loved this place, right? Anybody have fond memories of that first place you lived in or that first place you rented? We loved this place. We felt like grown-ups and adults. We went out and found it on our own. We bought all kinds of furniture, mostly from IKEA, to put in there. We hosted people and had people over. Like, we loved this place. It was also the place where my joy of making pizza was born, because we were so poor. Like, we had to make our own pizza rather than going to order pizza. I mean, we loved this place, but it was a total dump. I mean, it was just a dump. I mean, it smelled funny. It had old carpet. It had one of those laundry rooms in the basement where you had to share it with everybody else in the building, and you were unsure, is somebody going to mess with my clothes? Am I going to have to move somebody else's clothes from the wash to the dryer just to put my clothes in? It was just it was rowdy always, the grounds around. We went back after we moved back here from Atlanta. We were in Chicago, and I was like, oh, let's drive by our old place. Wouldn't that be fun? And we drove into the parking lot, and I was like, we lived here? This is where it was? And so we had this window in our kitchen in this place that was literally like a storm window. I mean, it wasn't insulated. There was no double pane. It was just like a sheet of glass in between the outside and the inside. And every winter, it would freeze over. There would be a sheet of ice. You couldn't see out of it. It looked like a frosted piece of glass that you'd find in a bathroom, but this was naturally frosted with actual frost, right? And it wasn't just that the window would get frosty, but the trim around it, I mean, you would have a 1/4 inch of ice growing off the window through, you could chip ice off into your drink and cool your drink down with the ice. It was just a mess. We had this, window unit AC that was built into the wall. It wasn't in a window, it was built into the wall. And one spring I went to go turn it on, and I noticed that the wall around it was looking kind of funny, and I went to touch it, and it was spongy, and I could push my finger into the wall. When all the ice would melt from the window, it would just kind of run down into the sill, and it would get moldy, and it would get mildewy, and it looked brown and gross. And so there was a point where it was just looking really bad, and I called our landlord, and I said, hey, just so you know, the window in the kitchen looks really bad. It's rotting. The window or the AC unit is rotting the wall. You might want to come look at these things. She's like, oh yeah, I'll make sure I fix them. Sure, happy to do it. And I said, we're actually going to be gone next weekend. We'll be gone for 3 or 4 days. You could come in and take care of it while we're gone. And she's like, oh, that's a great idea. I'll do that. So we leave for the weekend, and we come home, and I'm expecting to see all of this stuff fixed and repaired. I'm expecting there to be a new window where the window was with all the molding and everything fixed. I'm expecting the wall around the AC unit to be cut out, probably with some nice wood trim to prevent that from happening again. I walk into the kitchen and I look down at the window, and all she did, or had somebody do, was paint over the mildew and the mold. I went over to the AC unit, and the space around it just had a fresh coat of paint around it, and that was it. And I was like, Becky, we need to find a new place to live. This thing is going to fall apart before we know it. And I wonder if anybody here has ever had something similar happen to them, meaning you expect something to be done a certain way, and you find that it's not done the way you expected it. Meaning, maybe you have a leak in your roof, and you're like, hey, I'm going to go hire somebody to fix this leak. And they say they come, they do it. They say, yeah, we fixed it. And then they leave, and the next time it rains, it leaks again. You're like, wait, I thought I hired somebody to fix that. Or maybe you have a noise in your car and it makes this really weird squeaky noise and you take it to the mechanic and you're like, I have this squeaky noise, can you fix it? And they're like, oh yeah, we'll fix it. And then you drive your car away and it seems fixed for like 2 days, but then the squeak comes back. You're like, I thought I paid somebody to fix this. So the question is, when you have moments like that, where you expect something to be done a certain way, and you expect results to be a certain way, and it's not the way you expected it or paid for it to be done, like, what do you do? What do you do? Like, at very least, you're going to call and say, like, hey, you didn't fix the roof. You didn't fix the leak in my roof. You're going to call the mechanic and be like, hey, this thing that you said that you fixed is still happening. At the very least, you'll probably do that. You might even get online and write a review and leave a bad review. You might even tell other people, like, hey, don't use this person again. They're not reliable. We've probably all had moments and experiences where we expect something to be done a certain way, and it's not done the way we expected it. But the real question is, like, what about when God expects something to be done a certain way? And what about when God has that expectation of you? Meaning he's expecting you to do something in a certain way. And what happens when we don't deliver on what God expects? Like, how is he going to respond to us? The parable we're looking at this morning explores that question, and the response of God in this parable might even be a bit surprising. This is how the parable begins. This is Matthew 25, starting in verse 14. Jesus says, again, it. Now, we've been looking at these parables that are about the kingdom. So the it here is a reference to the kingdom of God or the kingdom of heaven that Jesus is speaking about in this parable. Again, it, the kingdom of God, will be like a man going on a journey who called his servants and entrusted his wealth to them. To one he gave 5 bags of gold, to another 2 bags, and to another 1 bag, each according to his ability. And then he went on his journey. Now, understanding the context of this parable is really helpful in grasping the meaning of this. Because within the scope of Matthew's gospel, this parable is being told from Jesus days before he will go to the cross. This is the final week of his life, a few days left with the disciples, then he will die, and eventually he will leave them. Jesus is about to leave. In John's gospel, he will get real explicit and tell his disciples, I'm not going to be with you much longer. I'm about to leave you. And in this parable, what does the master do? It says the master, he leaves. He goes on a journey and he leaves his servants behind. So it's fair to assume that in this parable, the master is representing Jesus. And what does the master do before he goes on this journey? He gives. The master gives. He gives and he entrusts some of his money, his wealth, to his servants. Now, the NIV here says that what he gives them is bags of gold. But in Greek, the word there is the word for talent. And talent in the first century world was not a skill, like somebody has artistic talent or athletic talent. A talent was a unit of measurement, specifically weight. It weighed something. It's how you calculated weight. Now, we said last week in looking at the parable from last week that a common day's pay in the ancient world was 1 denarii. You go and work in somebody's field. At the end of the day, they will pay you 1 denarii. And it was 6,000 denarii that equaled 1 talent. So meaning if you were to weigh, a denarii being a coin, so 6,000 of these coins would weigh 1 talent, so 6,000 denarii equal 1 talent. So that means 1 talent would be equivalent to about 16 or 17 years worth of income. And depending on how you calculate it transposing it to what it would be worth today, some biblical scholars say that it's roughly $1 million. One talent would be pretty close to $1 million today. And so what we see here is that the master is giving generously to his servants. He gives one guy 5 talents, one 2, and one 1. If each talent is roughly $1 million, he's giving $8 million to his servants. Now, he's not just giving it to them, right? It's not as though he's just saying, hey, this is yours to keep. Because we learn that he has an expectation with it. But this is what the men do with the money. This is verse 16. The man who received 5 bags of gold went at once and put his money to work and gained 5 more bags. So also the one with 2 bags of gold gained 2 more. But the man who received 1 bag went off, dug a hole in the ground, and hid his master's money. So not only does the master here give to his servants, the master also expects. Like, he has an expectation with this money. There's a parallel version of this story in Luke's gospel, Luke 19. And right before the master leaves, in Luke 19, he tells the servants in verse 14, put this money to work until I come back. And so even though you don't see that command explicit in Matthew 25, you do see that there is an expectation that these servants would put this money to work, meaning that they would multiply his money so that when he comes back, if he's giving them 5 talents, 2 talents, 1 talent, each one of these servants would have done something with the money to grow it, to multiply it, so that the master would have more. And what we learn is that 2 of the servants did a good job with dealing with the master's money. This is what we read in verse 19. After a long time, the master of those servants returned and settled accounts with them. Verse 20, the man who received 5 bags of gold brought the other 5. Master, he said, you entrusted me with 5 bags of gold. See, I have gained 5 more. His master replied, well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful with a few things, and I will put you in charge of many things. Come and share in your master's happiness. The man with 2 bags of gold also came. Master, he said, you entrusted me with 2 bags of gold. See, I have gained 2 more. His master replied, well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Come and share in your master's happiness. So the master leaves, and before he leaves, he gives money to the servants. He expects that they're going to put that money to work to multiply it, to grow it for him. And when he comes back and these 2 servants show that they have done what he expects to do, the last thing he does is he gives them a reward. He gives, he expects, and then he rewards. Now, the Western imagination, when it comes to receiving a reward for a job well done, usually means we expect, we're going to get a promotion. Meaning we probably will get paid more. We'll get rewarded in compensation. And then when we kind of translate that imagination on getting a reward to spiritual things, like for some reason, that imagination of wealth comes to mind as well, and we start to think, one day I'm going to get to heaven, and I'm going to stand before Jesus. And my hope is Jesus will say to me what he said to these 2 servants, well done, good and faithful servant. And then when I cross into heaven, I'm going to finally have my mansion in the sky, right? Like we have this association that the reward that we get in heaven somehow is wrapped up in consumerism, monetary stuff, a mansion in the sky. We're all going to have big, sprawling mansions. We're going to live on streets paved with gold, and it's just going to be this wonderful bastion of wealth in the sky. But notice here, the master doesn't reward his servant with wealth. He didn't say anything about wealth. What does he give him? Responsibility. He said, great, you've done a good job here. I'm going to give you more to do. I'm going to put you in charge of more things. You are going to have greater responsibility. But what this parable does for us in part is it confronts us with the reality that sometimes we lose sight of the responsibility that we have in following Jesus and participating in his kingdom. Like many of us would say, yes, sign me up for the benefits of following Jesus. Sign me up for what I think are my perceived rewards, a lot of times coming from the relationship with Jesus that I hope to have. Meaning, like Jesus offers us in relationship with him peace in troubled times. Like when life seems really chaotic and out of control and we can call on the peace of God, like let the peace of God guard your hearts. Oh, like, yes, I want peace in difficult situations. Like, sign me up for that. When Jesus says, come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. When you enter into this relationship with me, I'll give rest for your souls. You're like, yes, I could use some rest. Like, we love the benefits that come from a relationship with Jesus, but sometimes we lose sight of the reality that with Jesus, it's about relationship and responsibility. It's about both. There's this great place in Mark 6 where Jesus is out with the disciples, and he really lets them feel the weight of the responsibility that they have in following him. They're actually trying to get away with Jesus for a spiritual retreat. Their retreat is hijacked by all of these crowds, and Jesus spends the day teaching all of these people who have gathered around him. And at the end of the day, the disciples come to him and say, hey, Jesus, it's late. These people haven't eaten anything. Why don't you send them away so that they can get something to eat? And Jesus turns to the disciples and he says, well, you give them something to eat. Like, you do it. And they're just like, you can like read that story and just feel the weight. Like, that's 7,000 people, Jesus. How are we supposed to feed them? Like, there's weighty responsibility in following Jesus. And when we do well with that responsibility that he has given us, he's like, great, I'm going to give you more responsibility. But the second reward is this. He says to both these servants, you have done well, here's more to do. But then he says, come, share in my happiness. The word there is joy, kara, which means joy. Share in my joy. The rewards he gives is greater responsibility and joy. Now, we're not told the specifics of what that means to share in the master's happiness. But it seems to revolve around the work that they're doing, because he's like, here's more work to do. Here's more responsibility to have. Share in my joy while you take on this responsibility and work. I wonder here if anybody has ever had an experience where you experience great joy working alongside somebody, not because of the task that you're doing, but because you're doing it with that individual, right? You could be doing a menial, terrible, horrible, awful task where you're like, man, but I get to do it with this person, and it is so great, right? When I was about 9 or 10 years old, we lived in Pueblo, Colorado, and my dad's grandmother passed away one summer, and as we entered into the fall, there was the responsibility of doing all the things to do with her house, right? She lived on her own until she was in her 90s and still had this house. And so that meant the family had to deal with the house, had to deal with all the stuff. And so my dad was going to be part of that with his parents. And so over the course of a month, he had to take these trips from Pueblo, Colorado to Liberal, Kansas, this tiny little town in Kansas. He knew he was going to have to travel 3 times to go do stuff with this house, sort through stuff, get rid of it, sell it, whatever. And so what he decided to do is each time he took a trip, he was going to take myself and one of my brothers with him so that he could spend one-on-one time. And I was over the moon about this trip with my dad. I mean, we had to drive 5 hours in the car, which this was before there was like personal devices and screens and be able to watch movies. We just like had to drive there. Spend a full day just like sorting through all of this old junk that my great-grandmother had, like clearing stuff out, loading stuff on a trailer that we had to take somewhere else, and then we had to drive back. And it was one of the best trips I ever had with my dad. We have this shared memory. If you were to go ask my dad, what's one of the best sandwiches you have ever eaten? He would say, oddly enough, a ham and cheese sandwich from Love's. Do you guys know Love's? It's a gas station, right? That's in like middle of nowhere in the Midwest part of the country. We were driving back from Kansas. We needed lunch. We stopped off at a Love's. We went inside and we both got a ham and cheese sandwich. We heated it up in the microwave, went in the car and ate it. We finished it and we looked at each other and said, that was amazing. We should go get another one, right? Like that was 30 years ago. I can remember it like it was yesterday. Why? Because I was doing it with my dad. Because we had this opportunity to do this work together and share in the joy of being together in that work. So part of what Jesus is doing with this parable is he's showing that joining in God's work brings joy. Joining with God in his work in the world brings joy to your heart. In part because you get to use the gifts that God has naturally given you to employ in this world to bring him glory. And you get to partner with him while you do it. What an incredible responsibility, but also what an incredible opportunity. An opportunity to partner with God, living into who he has fully made you to be. Now, sometimes we perceive that doing the work that God has called us to do, using the gifts that God has called us to give, because God has invested something in you, generously he has invested something in you. Sometimes we think that equals, or that means, or we translate that to be overtly spiritual and or churchy sort of work. That if I'm going to use my gifts, it has to be in a very clear spiritual context. Well, when I was in grad school, there was a guy named Pete Moberg, and Pete owned a mechanic shop. He was an auto mechanic, and he owned his own garage. And he would service all sorts of seminary students. So when I found out that I needed to get work done on my car my first year, somebody's like, go to Pete's. He'll take care of you. Because Pete was a Christian. And he didn't just serve seminary students because we were seminary students. He treated everybody the same, but they said, if you go to Pete, you know you will be in good hands. And so Pete had this reputation, not only amongst the school and the professors, but all through that part of the city as just being a really good, honest mechanic. And one year, the chapel director of our school did this series called The Kingdom Comes To, and then you fill in the blank. So each week, he took somebody from the community who worked a quote-unquote secular job and brought them into chapel service for them to tell how they view their work as a spiritual practice, as a ministry, if you will. And so Pete got brought into chapel one day. He was up on stage with the chaplain of our school, and they just interviewed each other. He interviewed him, and he talked about how he views his work as a ministry and how God has created him to work on cars, and he loves cars, and he finds that he's overjoyed working on cars, and he realized, I can serve the Lord fixing people's cars. I can share the love of Jesus fixing people's cars. And so the question is like, what has God given you? What has he invested in you, and how can you use that for his glory? Frederick Buechner, who was a pastor and a writer in Vermont, said, here's how you find your calling in life. Your calling in life is where your greatest passion intersects and meets the world's deepest needs. The place God calls you is where your deepest passions meets the world's needs. And so the question is, what has God given you? Two questions. What has God given you? Right, in this story, he's giving money to be multiplied, but really, it's not just about money. The question is, what has God given you? What has he entrusted to you? What has he invested in you? And what are you doing with it? How are you using it? Are you seeing the things that he has put in your care as something you can use for the sake of developing his kingdom? Or do you just think it's a coincidence that this is just who you are, this is just the job that I have, this is just the place that I live? What has God given you, and what are you doing with it? Now, there's one more question we have to ask, because there's 3 guys in this parable. 2 guys do well, and then there's one other guy, which leads us to our last question, and that question is, what happens if you don't use it? What happens if you don't put it to use? And this is where the parable goes next. This is verse 24. Then the man who had received 1 bag of gold came. Master, he said, I knew that you are a hard man, harvesting where you have not sown and gathering where you have not scattered seed. So I was afraid and went out and hid your gold in the ground. See, here is what belongs to you. Now, if you read that part of the story, there's a good chance it might be disruptive for you, because we've already said that the master is supposed to represent Jesus, but here this servant seems to be saying that this master is dishonest. He calls him a hard man, saying you reap and you gather where you have not sown seed, which seems to be calling out that he's not a up-and-up guy. Now, depending on your perception of Jesus, though, you may anticipate Jesus having a certain response to this guy. He says, I was afraid. I didn't know how this was going to go. I didn't want to disappoint you. I didn't want to lose your money, so I just hid it away. And here it is, at least I didn't lose any. And again, if this master is supposed to represent Jesus, you might anticipate that he comes over and he puts his arm around the guy and he's like, hey, man, it's okay. You know, buddy, like we'll try it again. We all have bad days. We all make mistakes. I believe in you. That's why I gave you this. And it's going to be okay. So let's just get out there and try it again. What do you say? This is what the master says. You wicked, lazy servant. So you knew that I harvest where I have not sown and gather where I have not scattered seed. Well then, you should have put my money on deposit with the bankers so that when I returned, at least I would have received it back with interest. It's like, wait, what? It almost seems as though the master is affirming what the servant says of him. Like you know these things to be true about me, and so yeah, you should have at least done this. And then he goes on to say this in verse 28. So take the bag of gold from him and give it to the one who has 10 bags. For whoever has will be given more, and they will have an abundance. And whoever does not have, even what they have, will be taken from them, and throw that worthless servant outside into the darkness where there is weeping and gnashing of teeth. And that's where the story ends. Bless you, have a good day, right? It's like, wait, so how is this supposed to represent Jesus? Like, is this what God expects of me? Like, he's all about my performance. He's all about results. And if I don't perform, if I don't produce results, he's going to cast me aside? Now, we said at the beginning that understanding the context of this parable is helpful in understanding the meaning of this parable, because this parable is given in the final weeks of Jesus' life. You cross into Matthew 21, Jesus has entered Jerusalem for the final time. Matthew 21 through 23 is primarily Jesus teaching in the temple. If you have a Bible open and you turn to chapter 24, verse 1, it marks a move in the story. Chapter 24, verse 1 says, Jesus left the temple. So Matthew writes this story, setting the scene that from chapter 21 through chapter 23, Jesus is in the temple and he's teaching anybody who'll listen to him. And then in chapter 24, he leaves, and he leaves with his disciples. So that means chapter 24 and chapter 25 are one unit where Jesus is walking on the road, going to Bethany where he's staying, which is right outside Jerusalem, talking to the disciples and sharing these things with them. The last thing that Jesus says in the temple, the last part of chapter 23, is he pronounces woes on the Pharisees. He says really hard things about the Pharisees. Almost a half chapter says 7 things about the Pharisees, saying that they are hypocrites, they are blind fools, they are whitewashed tombs, they're greedy, they're self-indulgent, they're just prioritizing making themselves look good at the expense of others, they exclude people, they judge people. And some scholars wonder what Jesus is doing with this part of the parable is he's actually making an indictment on the Pharisees because they have been entrusted with a lot. They have the very words of God. They were supposed to be the people that represented and taught and showed God to the world. They were also supposed to expand God's people to the Gentiles, but instead of opening up the people of God to the Gentiles, they closed it off. They didn't use what they were given for the sake of God. They did it and they used it for themselves. And so some scholars wonder, even though we think that we read this parable and we think it's about us, meaning Jesus has left, right? So he's talking about that time that's going to come when he will have left. So he's talking about the future, which definitely makes sense. But it could also be that at the same time, he's talking about the present as well. And he's talking about the Pharisees, who he's just pronounced woes over, saying, don't be like them. Use the things that God has given you for the sake of other people. Don't use them just for yourselves to make yourself look good, to give yourself a good reputation, to impress other people. Take what God has given you, put it to work, trust that it will multiply, but do it for the sake of others. And so the question is, what is God given you? We've been saying each week when you come in, you find these cards on your seats in the pews, asking you to reflect on a certain question, to share it with everybody else, hanging it up on the twine that's hung up throughout the lobby. And that question is, what has God given you? What has he entrusted to you? And how are you using it? And are you using it for the sake of other people? Because if you do, you will experience joy, because joining in God's work brings joy. And what we see in Jesus in the way that he does his work is, again, he does it for the sake of others. He comes and he lays down his life for the sake of the world. He gives of himself for you and I, so that through his death on the cross, we can have redemption, salvation, and find ourselves in his family. And as he did that, it says in Hebrews that he experienced joy. He experienced joy in going to the cross because he knew what it would bring for us. And so when you use what God has entrusted to you for the sake of others, you find joy comes your way as well. And so what we're going to do this morning to respond to this message is we're going to go before the Lord's table. Because in this simple meal of the bread and the cup, we have an embodiment of Jesus' sacrifice for us. His joy put on display of lowering himself, sacrificing himself for our sake. And so in just a moment, we're going to invite the ushers to come up and dismiss you row by row. And we're all going to go before the Lord's table together. We're going to take the cup, we're going to take the bread, we're going to take it back to our seats and reflect on that question, like, what has God given me? Jesus clearly gave himself, all of himself for us. So what has God given me? And how am I using it? Am I bringing him glory with it? And then when we're done, we're going to take the elements all together. And so what you'll find up front are 4 stations. They're all the same. In the trays, you're going to find 2 cups stacked with a piece of bread on the bottom, some juice on the top. Take the full stack. If you take just the top part of the stack, you're only going to have the blood of Christ, not the body of Christ. So when your ushers dismiss you, we're going to invite you to come up through the center aisle. You can go to either station because they're the same and return to your seat through the side aisle. If you need help getting some elements, if you're not able to come forward, just ask one of the ushers. Maybe you can have somebody around you grab you some. We want to make sure everybody can have communion this morning. And then again, just take some time and reflect on that question. What has God given to me? In the same way that God gave himself for us, am I giving myself and what he has given me for the sake of others? And then I'll come back up and lead us in taking communion together. Let's pray. Lord, we thank you so much for what this meal represents, for the love that is embodied with this meal. And we ask, Lord, that you would demonstrate to us through this meal how much you have given for us. We also ask in this moment that you would show us how much you have given to us for the sake of putting it to work in your kingdom. So we ask, Lord, that you would give us eyes to see, that you would give us ears to hear, that we would be people who are quick to respond to what you are doing in our lives for the sake of others. Pray this in your name. Amen.